having engaged the community in this way, what are their expectations of this process in terms of the next step?
Hi, good day. Just a quick comment and then a sort of question. With regards to the landfill paper, I think there's a lot of studies to be done on the question that was raised here with can those things be converted into a landfill? Those things, the dump, the lavas, cannot be considered a landfill at all, scientifically. And the process of extracting and capturing methane off of that thing, you need to do heavy investment in terms of remodifying the entire thing. So that's a serious investment, and there have been a number of studies that have explored that and have reached almost dead ends by the colossal magnitude of that investment. I don't know if you are familiar with these studies, specifically on the library. On the lavas. I can give you those studies if you don't have them. The next question, looking towards library, my question would be sort of, that is in the area, I've spent time in the area, I've lived in Bethany for some time, and what's interesting is that that's an area of Trinidad that's being targeted for the development of the oil sands. And I don't know how much people are familiar with this, but they estimated that there are over 200 billion barrels of oil sands within that geographic area. So my question is to those participants and other members in the room who are familiar with that region, have you heard of this? And do you have any sort of inclination as to, is this something that people are beginning to introduce into those communities? And do you have any perspectives on what consequences that has socially and environmentally? Thank you.
Yeah, take one more. Just one more. We have another. Okay.
Hi, good morning. Just one quick question, actually relating to the same library and sustainability. Actually, what this question had to do with was also, again, relating to the whole question with civil society, it's all interconnected. What specifically, in terms of will be needed for us to, in a library or in any community for that instance, create a sort of framework to lend itself to reinvestment. Reinvestment of the dollars, because we are extracting from, minerals from these communities. What sort of model or framework would you suggest should be put in place for corporate entities that come and extract minerals and materials from these communities to reinvest into the communities? And what sort of, to me, what has the civil society on the ground, mentioned in terms of, that sort of reinvestment into the community for that sort of sustainable development of the community? Thanks.
One more, then I'll ask Amanda to respond.
Morning, everybody. Two questions, well, two sets of comments, one to Mr. Budan and to Mr. Dunton. I appreciate the research in terms of looking at reduction of carbon emissions, improving the ecological footprint of Trinidad and Tobago and our position. In the research, however, have you considered the cost for production per megawatt of electricity, especially since electricity can't be stored? And the point that has been made by some of the attendees here, which is the continuity of production from the landfill given its present construct. Because if you are to enter into a commercial arrangement with TNTech to distribute this electricity, there are going to be some legislative and some commercial issues regarding the monetization of the power itself. As well, have you considered the Ministry of Energy's thrust into renewable energy? That is, what it would cost again per megawatt versus the alternatives. For instance, your PV and your wind, and whether it makes economic sense, all things considered, to invest in that type of biomass generation. The last thing really is a point that Mr. Maguire raised. The current generation capacity of Trinidad and Tobago, no pun intended, there's an excess of that capacity now with the TGU situation. There isn't in the foreseeable future demand that will tap into that excess of 350 megawatts unless we decide to invite some big demand of electricity in the industrial sector. So you also have to look at whether, again, we need to start generating energy to fulfill some demand that is not there or not projected to be there. Again, granted that I would say the original intent would be the reduction of the carbon emissions. To Mr. Dunton, very interesting research. Just to focus on one area in the research, which is on your HDI, Human Development Index. We know that GDP, for instance, can't measure how much time you spend in traffic every day, how much time you'll spend at the hospital trying to get treatment, even the fact that 80% of people don't get water 24/7. So have you at all, or is anybody thinking about Professor Stiglitz's work on gross happiness measurement? And do we have data that could help us to approach a calculation of our gross happiness index? If we don't have that data, who is doing the research and who is discussing with CSO and the other data collectors what we need to do to start collecting that data? Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm just going to ask the panelists to respond very quickly.
Remember, one of the phases that are related to the phenomenological strand will be the action phase. And the action phase for qualitative research actually involved, one of the validation methods of phenomenology is that you have to show the interviewees the transcripts, right?
Just answer this.
Right?
Running out of time.
Oh, okay.
Let's get to
So what happened is that we had meetings to try and because one of the things that was identified in fighting co-optation and opportunity hoarding. So what we did is try to have meetings with the civil society groups in order to get an MOU that they can take to the companies. There are two companies, Mitsubishi and Caribbean Gas, that are trying to come into the community there and to establish plants. What happened is that the question of patronage versus stakeholders, what we recognize is that the traditional handout that characterizes these companies, a handout, I'll pay for a family day, I'll sponsor a football league, nothing substantial. In terms of that same model they wanted to follow, however, they wanted to be recognized as stakeholders, and the companies were not willing to do that. Even when individually, I'll give you an example with the Japanese. When we spoke to the Japanese, they were willing to fund stuff, but the local persons who were their business partners were against that specific idea. Even when they recognized that the university, one faculty member even went down to contribute to the strengthening of civil society, they were antagonistic towards us when we went. So that's what is happening in the Brady.
Tell me something. There's the idea that Library has considerable resource in terms of the barrels of oil sands, the possibility of developing that. Did that come up at all?
The thing is, there was a public lecture that was held in UE concerning that oil sands. And what we need to recognize is that asphalt as itself is underutilized as a resource in Trinidad and Tobago. They export it in the raw form, and then there was someone who did a really innovative something with creating something to coat buildings, etc. In the early, let's say 19th century, when it was owned by foreigners, they took out 150 patents for applications for pitch, which are still applicable or holding today. So when I tried to do the research as regard what applications that you can do with asphalt that these patents are based on, it's very hard to get the data. And the oil sand, they kick in against it, because in terms of guys from Canada, they came down and they mentioned the deleterious effects it can have in terms of the industry. And then the last thing would be definition of community leaders. That was identified as a limitation of the study, where only persons with formally registered entities were used as the sample for the study. What happened is that there were persons in the community, the civil society leaders identified them, who do not belong to any civil society group, who are long-standing members of the community. So that was a limitation that was addressed in the study.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And I just want to get quick responses to the price per kilowatt hour used for the analysis of the landfill gas in your cost-benefit analysis. And of course, there's a very good question here around, is there the demand for this in Trinidad and Tobago now that we have
Yes, I acknowledge the excess capacity in Trinidad and Tobago, but initially this study was basically not really to supply Trinidad and Tobago with electricity, but just to bring about projects to supply communities located close to the landfills. So it's not really to increase Trinidad and Tobago capacity in general, but focus on communities. Okay. And in terms of the per kilowatt, that is still needs to be calculated, because this is what I presented, is what I have so far, what I estimated. But I plan to do this to make the actual comparison. In terms of the other question, the lavas, the study looks at solely solid municipal solid waste and not liquid lavas, whatever. So it will not look at the entire landfill itself, just organic municipal solid waste. And yes, I would like to see the studies on.
Thank you. And just finally now on sustainable development indicators, there was a question around gross happiness indices that have been developed around the world now. How applicable is this to Trinidad and Tobago context? Have you considered trying to include some of the factors associated with that particular change in your methodology?
Well, to first answer, I think you first asked a question regarding the CSO and the CSO ability to collect data. The CSO in Trinidad, well, generally, we in Trinidad and Tobago is not a data-driven economy. And this is reflected in our CSO. And the fact that it is underfunded and don't have both the physical institutional capacity, the mental institutional capacity, and the equipment and technologies of a modern 21st century. Within a Sustainable Development Index framework, it will require us bringing this up to par with the rest of the world. And to answer the question on the Well-Being Index, there is 2 Well-Being Index internationally right now. The Happy Planet Index by the New Economics Foundation, and they ranked us as 136 out of 151 countries in terms of well-being. And there's also a well-being index by Gallup, who does the political tracking and stuff in the USA. We are ranked very low on that index also. So given our increases in wealth and how much resources we have, we still have low level of well-being. And all these are included in the index itself, because it has social dimensions, economic dimensions within my index that I'm developing itself. So it will include all these variables into the index. The problem is data collection. So that is my headache going forward.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, that brings us to the end of this first panel on day 2. Could I invite you to give the presenters a round of applause?
Framework or the conditions that confront people who are starting new businesses. So these are some ideas of the kinds of things that we do with GEM. The basic GEM model sees the entrepreneurship process as a set of stages or phases where we begin. Is there a pointer? No? Okay. We begin with as a potential entrepreneur. Many people, if you think about it, everybody here has some kind of idea for a business. Every Trinidadian does. And whether you act on that is what will determine whether you go to the next step of starting to put a business together, starting thinking about how you would capitalize on this opportunity and so on. Eventually, the business is open, and in most cases, eventually the business is closed. Either it is sold to somebody else or handed over, or the demise of the entrepreneur happens. There's a number of those. The thing is that by breaking the process up like this and asking the right questions, we can get some tremendous insights into the entrepreneurial environment. We use 2 key instruments. The Adult Population Survey, or APS, covers a minimum of 2,000, is a representative sample of 2,000 adults in the population, which means that we cover La Brea and all over South and North. And the NES, or the National Expert Survey, is a survey where we ask a similar set of questions to 40 experts, and the identity of those experts changes year on year. These people would be drawn from banking, finance, education, business and so on. There's a whole format from the GEM uses to select, to identify and select these experts. This gives us a unique data set. Because we talk to individuals rather than to firms, we get to pick up things that take place with the entrepreneur before he actually opens a business. So we get to understand the perceptions and aspirations of people with regard to entrepreneurship. We capture everything on the informal sector. We capture a lot of activity that goes on before the launch of a business. And we harmonize with other countries. So GEM actually takes all the data sets and approves and does whatever needs to be done. So when we compare our data with other countries, you're comparing apples with apples. It's not a hodgepodge of different data. This is the conceptual framework of GEM. I don't have time to go into it, but you can see from this that we really exhaust the environment with the survey instruments. And this is our first slide on attitudes and perceptions. If you look at starting from perceived capabilities, Trinidad is the red line in this wagon wheel, and you can see that we perceive ourselves as, or the APS respondents perceive themselves as extremely capable of operating a business when compared with the rest of Latin America and the rest of the world. We're only the highest in the world on perceived capability. Almost everybody in Trinidad, as I said, perceives an opportunity. If you find a Trinidadian who doesn't have an idea for a business, there's probably something wrong with that person. Everybody has an idea for a business. But we don't all necessarily act on that idea. Entrepreneurship here is perceived as a great career choice. This is not so in all countries. In many countries, the challenge is convincing people that going into your own business is a good thing. It has a development potential and so on. And entrepreneurs here in Latin America also tend to enjoy a high status. We look at fear of failure. This is a major barrier in many countries. For us, it is not a problem. We have the lowest rate of fear of failure as a barrier to entrepreneurial activity. A couple of years ago, we were the lowest in the world, and you'll see some data in a little while. We're still among the very lowest. In terms of intent, the blue line is Trinidad. So we're more or less well placed as far as the intention of adults in Trinidad to go into their own business. Turning away from attitudes and perception, I just wanted to give you a sense of how the public feels about this based on our survey. And we look at the actual in-place entrepreneurs now. Generally, in most countries, men are more likely to be entrepreneurs than women, and we fit that pattern also. In terms of the age breakdown, we fit the international pattern of bell curve with the mode somewhere around in the 30s. This one is interesting. Of the people who are actually entrepreneurs in Trinidad, about half have completed secondary school education, and a little less than a quarter have completed some kind of tertiary education. In terms of financing, I'll rush through this slide because I can tell where we're going. Most of the entrepreneurial businesses in Trinidad can be opened with very little amounts of money. $20,000 TT dollars will open one third of all entrepreneurial businesses. $30,000 will open half of the business. And when we look at data from the NES, we see some issues in the banking sector and so on that are gradually being dealt with through interventions that I'll come to in a moment. This is more detail on our beliefs about ability. This is the blue line in Trinidad. You can see that the Trinidad respondents perceive themselves highly favorably when you compare with other countries, for instance, the USA, which is closer to the middle. We rank in this data set number 7 in the world, and we rank number 4 in the world in terms of not having fear of failure as an obstacle to going into a business. When we ask, however, the experts in the NES panel the same question, we get a completely different answer. So the public sees themselves as business savvy, as fully capable of doing this. the experts, the people in education and finance and banking and so on, say, no, not so much. There's a mismatch between the perception of the public and the perception of the expert part. This has been a recurring theme in our research for the all four cycles, that we have this disagreement between the two. Part of the issue may come from the education system. You may recall that half of the entrepreneurs have a high school education. But when we look at entrepreneurial skills and entrepreneurial content in the high school and below and lower curriculum, there's a lot missing. This is gradually improving with the introduction of, for instance, COTE now has an entrepreneurship as a subject. But still, most of our resources in developing entrepreneurial skills are channeled at tertiary education. And you'll recall that the majority of these people don't access tertiary education. So these bullet points, which I will not repeat, give us a kind of snapshot of entrepreneurs in Trinidad based on the slides that we've seen. I'll go now to performance. Thank you. Well, is that 15 minutes or 5 minutes? Right, good. In terms of innovation, so we're going to look at entrepreneurship as a vehicle for diversification or development. There will be three key things that we can extract from this data. And if you look at this here, you can see most of our entrepreneurial activity is replicated. We actually rank the lowest in Latin America on most of the innovation-related questions in the GEM research. I'll just skip this. Job creation is another big factor. If again we can see this sector as being the engine for development, for diversification. This gives us an idea of the job-creating aspirations of the public. And you can see here that we're like third from the bottom in Latin America in terms of the capacity of the adult population to create jobs through entrepreneurial activity. The prediction of an entrepreneur about the number of jobs that he's going to create in the next 5 years is an extremely accurate measure of a very powerful estimate of what the reality will be. In terms of international orientation, no surprise there, the vast majority of our entrepreneurial businesses have no overseas customer. So the thing is, from our work so far, we see that for entrepreneurship to play the role that is embodied in the MTPF in the various policy documents, we need to move entrepreneurship from what it is into something that is job creating, has some kind of export potential, has some kind of innovation or innovative component. And so we have a big discussion in our report about measures to identify, promote, finance, and to make changes for the education system. We've been doing this for 4 years. We have an agenda here. What we're doing now with the project is working much more closely with the agencies that support entrepreneurship. I was delighted to see Curtis Mayers here. I usually bother him in his office here on campus. He's in NETCO. Thank you, sir. And he's been a great support for this. We're working closely with NETCO. This year, in the APS, we've included questions about the experiences that people have in dealing with these agencies. So how simple is it? If you have an idea, where do you go? Who do you talk to? How simple is it for you to access government programs to come up with to make the business a reality? We have many special topics in our reports. I'm a health economist, so when you have a hammer, last year we included a comparison of the health status of entrepreneurs versus people who work for others. We have I won't go into detail on it. So I'll just say this, that we have this growing data set year on year on year. And we're eager to engage academics, people doing research. If your research touches on entrepreneurship, give us a call. We may have data that we could collaborate on, that we can do things with. What we're doing in this, we're actually launching this year's GEM report next week at the Arthur John School of Business. What we're doing now is we're now building a single document where we can map all of the support available to entrepreneurs in one place. So we have NEDCO, we have like 10 or 11 different agencies that all have a different interest, that do different things, eye to eye and so on and so forth. So we're putting this dossier together to have perhaps the only place where we have all this information in the same place. Do I have any time? One. That basically is, I just wanted to share with you what we're doing, how we see entrepreneurship as poised. Again, the big takeaways here. So we need to be doing more to promote and identify firms or people that are interested in doing things that are innovative, that have high growth potential, and that have some kind of export potential. NEDCO, as I said, has done a great job in dealing with the financing bottleneck that existed at one time. And now maybe more effort could be put into more, rather than broad brush approaches, but more pinpointed approaches, like eye to eye, of finding these sleeping giants. So,
thank you very much, Dr. Bailey. I now invite Mr. Kezra Lashley, and he's going to present on confronting the contemporary local and regional challenges for small